Welcome back, everyone. This video is going to cover the events of the Civil Rights Movement from the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955 through the events of 1968. So you see with the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955, the Civil Rights Movement and their leaders, such as Martin Luther King, sought to bring attention to the issues of segregation for African Americans in the Deep South. So Rosa Parks, as an NAACP officer, and three others were selected to sit in the white section of a segregated bus in Montgomery. Obviously, this broke the law. They were arrested, they were fingerprinted, they were put in jail. And this sparked the 381-day boycott of the busing in Montgomery, where 70% of the bus fares were due to the African American population in the city. So this was very economically problematic for the bus companies, and after that 381-day boycott, the companies were forced to desegregate or forced to go belly up. And this is the first time that we see MLK in the public light of the Civil Rights Movement, his involvement becoming increasingly more important moving forward. And we see with MLK and the formation of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in 1957, and their election of MLK as their president, that they really pushed for these staged protests and demonstrations, probably one of their more famous ones being the March on Washington, where they sought to bring attention to the issues faced by African Americans, really in particularly the Deep South, but in the United States as a whole. The bus boycott was not the only protest that they supported. We see that in 1960, with the beginning of the sit-in movement in Greensboro, Alabama, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, sought to bring attention to these segregated lunch counters, where young African Americans and young whites would sit at lunch counters asking for service, which they would be denied because they were segregated and they weren't sitting in the quote-unquote Negro section. And in doing so, they were not only breaking the law, but they were subject to the violence of the local crowds. And we see in the picture in the lower left-hand part of your screen that they had drinks poured over their head, they had ketchup and mustard sprayed over them, they had food thrown on them, they were beaten, they were kicked, punched, they had hot coffee thrown in their faces. They were both physically and verbally abused, but they weren't the ones being arrested, not their abusers. But we see that story continue with the Freedom Riders in 1961, who were attempting to desegregate interstate busing by going on a cross-country bus ride from Baltimore through D.C. and through different cities in the South. Initially, they didn't encounter much violence, but by the time they reached the Deep South, we see them encountering increasing levels of violence, even getting so far as we see in the picture in the lower right-hand corner of one of the Freedom buses being firebombed, and then the occupants of the bus being forced out of the bus into a crowd of angry whites that would eventually beat them near to death. But again, the angry white mob was not arrested, it was the Freedom Riders, because they were instigating this violence. The angry white mob was not responsible for beating them. They were responsible for themselves. And we see the leaders of the Civil Rights Movement pushing it even further with the Birmingham campaign from April to May of 1963, where they sought to confront this idea of the policy of segregation and bring it to the homes of broader America, where it wasn't just something that was going on in the South. So we see civil rights leaders like MLK, who was eventually arrested for the 13th time, coming to Birmingham, Alabama. And while spending time in jail, MLK would write what would become known as the letters from a Birmingham jail, where he outlined his his policy and the idea of civil disobedience and nonviolence, where he sought change through protest, through demonstration, not through fighting, not through guns, bullets, and weapons, but through other means, where they would bring to light these issues, and they would suffer consequences. Obviously, we see, in this case, people getting harassed. We saw with Rosa Parks. We saw with the sit-ins. We saw with the Freedom Rides. People were subject to violence, but the protesters were never to react. They were to only simply just turn the other cheek, as the Bible would say. And the civil rights leaders, again, just like another strategic decision, chose to enlist children in their protest to draw attention to the violent tactics of a man by the name of Bull Connor, who was the chief of police in Montgomery. He was violent in that he used fire hoses and police dogs against these children. And we see that in the pictures on the right-hand side of your screen, where the children were blasted against storefronts by fully open fire hoses. You see children being bitten by dogs, by police dogs. So the chief of police was not afraid to use force against these protesters who were not being violent themselves. But they weren't the only ones that were physically attacked. We see the MLK and the other civil rights leaders having their hotel bombed out and violence inflicted upon them. So again, it wasn't just the children. It wasn't just the individual protesters. And it got so out of hand that we see President Kennedy calling and putting heavy pressure on Congress to pass civil rights legislation, to pass civil rights laws that would prevent and stop and reverse things like segregation and these issues. But it just with the Birmingham campaign and the violence that ensued, that wasn't enough. We see that the Alabama governor, undeterred by the Birmingham campaign, continued to block the integration of the University of Alabama despite JFK's call for civil rights law. And we see President Kennedy even going so far as questioning whether or not we were upholding our highest ideals, whether we really were the land of the free. So were we just free except for the Negroes? So despite, again, or with his support of civil rights bill, they sought to give equal access to all public accommodations, to bathrooms, to busing depots, to restrooms, everything. They tried to force integration. And even though it had been outlawed by the Supreme Court case of Brown versus Board of Education, the federal government sought to defund schools that had remained segregated, such as the University of Alabama. But all this progress was not without sacrifice and not without loss. And we see with the incident of 16th Street church bombing in September of 1963 that these 4 girls lost their lives to a KKK bomb as it was placed at an important meeting place for the civil rights movement in Birmingham. And even though they weren't the targets of that attack, they still were unfortunate casualties of the event. Throughout the civil rights movement, they had many leaders, but probably the 2 most well-known leaders of the civil rights movement were Malcolm X and MLK. And they were very different from each other. They had very different philosophies, very different backgrounds. If we just kind of look here at our 2 charts, with MLK being pictured here on the left, Malcolm X being pictured here on the right. Obviously having different religions, but the most important aspect of this is the fact that they had different approaches to civil rights. MLK, we've talked about being an nonviolent civil disobedience protest demonstrations. But for Malcolm X, his philosophy was more so self-defense and self-preservation, because as he had seen and he had witnessed and he had taken part of as a young child during this, as a young man during this time period, that the violence of the white man had no end. That we had seen slavery, we had seen the devastation that it had incurred, and they weren't stopping. So the African Americans need to defend themselves. And if the whites weren't going to do it, then, or weren't going to stop being violent, then African Americans needed, out of self-preservation, needed to become violent. We see other similarities and some other differences in their upbringing, in their origins, that they're both, well, eventually both assassinated, both by people that oppose them. Obviously, we see James Earl Ray, a white man, assassinated MLK in the Lorraine Motel in April of 1968, and a few years earlier, Malcolm X was assassinated by members of the Nation of Islam, who he had formerly been involved with in February of 1965. But their upbringing and the difference in that was really the biggest striking difference for Malcolm X and MLK, where being orphaned at an early age, his father was killed by white supremacists. His mother was committed to a mental institution, and he spent time in prison for drugs and burglary during his youth. Really formed a mindset in Malcolm X to oppose the mixing of the white and black races, because in his view they could not go together. It was like oil and water. No matter how much you mix them up, no matter how much you put them together, they were never going to become one. Whereas we see MLK starting his education at 15 at Morehouse College, going into the church, the ministry in the church at age 18. He didn't have the same struggle as Malcolm X, and that really shaped his views in a different way.